The Rock and Roll Unraveled Show.
I'm Derek Shelmadine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled show. Now, in the 1950s, American rock and roll was exploding onto an unsuspecting world. Now, in the UK, as well as discovering the joys of the likes of Elvis, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis and various chums, we had our very own scene going on. And this is the story of how it all started in the UK. Now, trad jazz was very popular in the late 1940s, and these trad jazz bands developed their own integral skiffle groups. By the mid-1950s, skiffle groups were forming up and down the country, and as well as the skiffle groups, Britain's very own rock and roll heroes were emerging. Tommy Steele was the first, Billy Fury, Marty Wilde, some not quite so well known like Wee Willie Harris. Now, many of the skiffle groups became influenced more by American rock and roll, and by the late 1950s these groups were morphing into beat groups. Now, to get us in the mood, I'll have a Marty Wilde song. This was his first UK hit. It's actually a cover of a Jody Reynolds song. It gave him a top 5 in mid-1958, and this is Marty Wilde, Endless Sleep. British rock and roll very much has its origins in the trad jazz bands of the 1950s. They're traditional jazz. And that was a British take on New Orleans Dixieland jazz. And one of the key early guys was Ken Collier. Now, he was born in Great Yarmouth in Norfolk on the 18th of April 1928. He was a trumpeter, jazz band leader, and very much a seminal skiffle group guy. Now, he formed his Crane River Jazz Band in the late 1940s. But in the early 1950s, he became very disillusioned with British jazz and decided to take himself off to America and play with some of his musical heroes in New Orleans. Now, after some visa difficulties, he returned to the UK in 1953 and formed Ken Collier's Jazzmen, and that was with two other major figures from this era, Chris Barber and Lonnie Donegan. And on the 2nd of September 1953, Ken Collier's Jazzmen recorded New Orleans to London, an album on the Decca label, and it's one of British jazz's most influential albums. Now, the lineup included people who were all band leaders in their own right, obviously Ken Collier, Chris Barber, Tony Donegan, as he was then, and Monty Sunshine. He was a clarinetist. Now, in the middle of 1954, Chris Barber and Ken Collier parted company. Chris Barber went off and formed his own jazz band, and Ken Collier put a new band together. And this new band recorded their next album, Back to the Delta, on the 25th of June 54. Now, that contained 3 skiffle tracks and 6 band tracks, and the band tracks included clarinetist Bernard Bilk. Now, he found a lot of success in his own right with his own trad jazz band. And as Bilk, he had a massive hit on both sides of the Atlantic with Stranger on the Shore. Now, Alexis Corner was one of the members of his skiffle group. He played mandolin and vocals for the 3 skiffle numbers, and he pops up all through the story. Now, as I said, Chris Barber reformed his own jazz band in mid-54, though he had actually started out as an amateur band in the late 1940s with the Chris Barber's Jazzmen. And on the 13th of July 1954, Chris Barber's jazz band recorded their album New Orleans Joys, and that contained a couple of skiffle tracks, Rock Island Line and John Henry. Now, they were popularised by the folk blues legend Lead Belly, and they were credited on the album to the Lonnie Donegan skiffle group. But it wasn't until November 55, best part of 18 months later, that Rock Island Line was released as a single. But it entered the charts on the 6th of January 56, got into the top 10, and that's exactly what kick-started British rock and roll. Now, to give this some context, it was the 17th of December 54 when Bill Haley and his Comets with Shake, Rattle and Roll entered the British charts. It gave him a top 20, and that was the first ever UK rock and roll hit. Now, another one of the pioneers of the 1950s was Joe Meek. He was an engineer, producer, and one of his earliest outings as an engineer was with Gary Miller in the October of 1955 on Gary Miller's Yellow Rose of Texas. That was his first UK hit. And he was also the engineer in the July of 56 when Humphrey Lyttelton was in the studio to record Bad Penny Blues. That was actually turned out to be Humphrey Lyttelton's only UK hit, interestingly enough. But as well as Joe Meek as engineer on the single, George Martin was the head of A&R at Parlophone. He, of course, went on to be the Beatles' producer. And if the melody for Bad Penny Blues sounds familiar, we're just about to hear it, it's because it's very much the backbone for the Beatles' Lady Madonna. And this is the Humphrey Lyttelton Band with Bad Penny Blues. You're listening to Derek Shelmadine and the Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. We're taking a look at the British music scene in the 1950s. That's essentially a time of trad, jazz, skiffle and rock and roll. It was all brand new music, styles never heard before. Really exciting time to grow up. But before continuing with the story, an opportunity to win a signed copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Just check out the link on my homepage on rockandrollunravel.com, that's unravel with 2 L's, answer a simple question and you're in the draw for a signed copy of the book. Rock and Roll Unraveled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots to mid-1970s punk, and Record Collector Magazine's review described the book as comprehensive and invaluable. Thank you very much, Record Collector. Now, good luck with the competition, and let's get back to the plot. Well, skiffle very much developed out of the trad jazz bands at the time. They were the interval groups, interval skiffle groups. And when the other guys went to the bar for a smoke or a beer or whatever, the interval skiffle groups would come on and play this brand new music. This is around the mid-50s. The music was inspired by American folk blues, people like Leadbelly, and also American jug bands. Now they're interesting. They play conventional instruments, guitars, banjos, but also improvised instruments, homemade guitars, and use spoons and washboards for percussion. Now, washboard is a corrugated steel device used for washing clothes, funnily enough, and it was played with sewing thimbles on the fingertips. Oh, made a great sound. And they used a wash-tub bass, often called a tea-chest bass in the UK. And that was very much what it sounds like. It was a wooden box with a broomstick handle and a one-string attachment. Now, one of the earliest and most influential of the skiffle groups was Wally Whiten's group, the Vipers skiffle group, and they formed around early 1956. Very loose arrangement of musicians, as a lot of these skiffle groups had, with lots of people passing through their ranks. People like Tommy Steele, who became Britain's first rock and roll hero, and most of the original Shadows at one point or another. And on the 22nd of April 1956, the Two Eyes Coffee Bar opened in London's Red Light Soho district, and that was the launching pad for many of Britain's new skiffle groups. Now, performers here included people like Terry Dean, Wild Willie Harris, Adam Faith. He was in a skiffle group called the Worried Men in the early days, and Cliff Richard actually met future Shadows there, Hank Marvin and Bruce Welch. And the Vipers, well, they were the house band, probably the first. Now, Tommy Steele often guested with the Vipers, and he was discovered at the Two Eyes when he was playing with his own group, Tommy Hicks and the Cavemen. Now, the Cavemen, as well as Tommy Hicks, were Mike Pratt and Lionel Bart. And Larry Parnes, another very influential guy we'll hear a lot more about later, he signed up Tommy Hicks, and as he liked to, he changed his name to Tommy Steele. And on the 26th of October 1956, Rock with a Caveman gave Tommy Steele his first UK hit single. It was also the first homegrown British rock and roll hit single. And it was actually written by Tommy Steele, Lionel Bart and Mike Pratt. And the trio had previously played the skiffle bars as the Cavemen, but this was released as Tommy Steele and the Steel Men. And interestingly enough, one of the session musicians on the record is none other than jazz saxophonist and famous club owner Ronnie Scott. Now, Tommy Steele's second hit single gave him his one and only #1 hit. It was there for a week, and that was Singing the Blues. It was originally a Marty Robbins song, and Guy Mitchell had a UK #1 around the same time as Tommy Steele. Now listen out for the whistling in this song. That was very popular on songs in the 1950s. And this is Tommy Steele and the Steelmen with Singing the Blues. Now it had been recorded back in the July of 1954, but it wasn't released on a single until the end of 1955. And, well, history was made. British rock and roll history when on the 6th of January 1956, Lonnie Donegan's skiffle group and Rock Island Line entered the UK charts. Actually released on the Decca Jazz label, which was interesting, and that had been recorded by Chris Barber's jazz band for the album New Orleans Joys. Now the lineup on this single was Lonnie Donegan, vocals and guitar. He played banjo in the jazz band. Chris Barber, he played double bass on the single and trombone in the jazz band. And Beryl Bryden, another legend from the skiffle era, she played washboard. Lonnie Donegan was far and away the most successful of the skiffle artists. He had a total of 31 UK hit singles between 56 and 1962. And Rock Island Line actually made it onto the American charts as well in the March of 1956. Now, around the same sort of time, Beryl Bryden's backroom skiffle group released a single called Casey Jones and Kansas City Blues, and that featured Alexis Corner and Cyril Davis. Now, Beryl Bryden was very popular at the time. She sang with the Ken Collier Band, Chris Barber, Monty Sunshine, but she never had any hit singles in her own right. And it was early 1957 when Cyril Davis and Alexis Corner opened their Barrel House Club, and the name for the club was inspired by Johnny Otis's club in Los Angeles. Now, when these two pioneers of British R&B got together in the late 1950s, Cyril Davis was running the Thursday night London Skiffle Club at the Roundhouse. And when they got together to form a partnership, they wanted to focus more on blues-based music, and they changed the name of the weekly gathering to the London Blues and Barrel House Club. Well, 1957 when it really was all happening. The end of January, the Vipers had a hit with Don't You Rock Me Daddy-O. That was their first UK hit. They actually only had 3, all in 1957, and the last one was in the May of 1957. Skiffle was a very short-lived phenomenon, very much like punk. Well, in fact, it made punk look as if it had longevity in the 1970s. On the 16th of February, the first episode of the 6-5 special was broadcast, and that was the UK's first pop music show on television. It was on the BBC, and the opening credits were great. They showed a steam train zooming along, and co-presenter Pete Murray informed his live audience that it was time to jive on the old 6-5. Now, the show was originally produced by Jack Good before he moved across to ITV to produce Oh Boy, and the theme tune was courtesy of the resident house band Don Lang and his Frantic Five. 6-5 special ran for best part of a couple of years and saw the last episode on the 27th of December 1958. And it was late 56 when Nancy Whiskey joined Chas McDevitt. He was another stalwart of the skiffle era. And it was the April 57 when they had their first UK hit with Freight Train. They again just had 2 hit singles, both in the first half of 1957, and again they managed to score on the American charts, albeit for 1 week at number 40 with Freight Train. Now, Alexis Corner is very much associated with Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated and one of the godfathers of British blues. But in 1957 he actually released Blues from the Roundhouse as the Alexis Corner Skiffle group, and that featured Cyril Davis as well. But skiffle was really starting to fade away now. The Vipers and Chas McDevitt both had their final hits in mid-57, although Lonnie Donegan did continue into the early 60s. But this is a classic piece of skiffle. This is Chas McDevitt Skiffle Group, brackets, featuring Nancy Whiskey, with Freight Train. On the 16th of January 1957, the world-famous Cavern Club opened its doors on 10 Matthew Street in Liverpool, and that actually opened as a jazz club initially. About 600 people were there at that opening night, and the poster listed the Merseysippy Jazz Band, the Wall City Jazzmen, Ralph Watmer's Jazz Band and Coney Island Skiffle Group. Alan Sittner was the owner, and he welcomed skiffle but really was not a fan of rock and roll. On the 7th of August that year, John Lennon famously made his debut at the club with his skiffle group, the Quarrymen, and they opened with some skiffle songs and then gave a very unappreciative Alan Sittner a taste of Elvis Presley. Well, he wasn't happy about that, and they've quickly received a note on stage telling him to cut out the bloody rock. But by 1959, the club was owned by Ray McFall, and it slowly moved from being a 1950s jazz venue to really ushering in the 1960s beat music. And it was the 25th of May 1960 when they had their first beat night. Around about a year later, the Marquee Club in London held its first Jazz at the Marquee night. Now, a lot of the future beat groups were really learning their trade in skiffle. 6th of July 1957 was when John famously met Paul at a Quarrymen gig at Woolton Fete. Paul impressed them with his knowledge of all of the words to Eddie Cochran's 20 Flight Rock, and a couple of weeks later Paul was a Quarryman, and of course they went on to become the Beatles. 1957, Brian Casser met Bill Wyman. Brian Casser was a very big player in the 1950s Liverpool scene. And Bill Wyman, well, of course, he went on to be the bass player with the Rolling Stones. They formed a skiffle group at the sort of back end of 1957 after they'd met during national service. And in 1958, Jerry Marsden formed Jerry and the Mars Bars. They'd previously been Jerry Marsden's skiffle group, and of course they went on and became Jerry and the Pacemakers, another very successful Mersey beat group. UK rock and roll really arrived in October of 56 with Tommy Steele's Rock with a Caveman. That was the first homegrown rock and roll chart success. In 57, of course, you had the Five Dallas Boys. They released a track called Shangri-La. They didn't achieve an awful lot of commercial success, the Dallas Boys, but they were very popular at the time, and they were probably the first British boy band. But British rock and roll really came of age in the spring of 1958. Harry Webb and the Drifters formed, and John Foster was their manager at that time. He had a lot to do with the creation of the band and the image. And shortly after they formed, they changed their name to Cliff Richard and the Drifters. Marty Wilde and the Wildcats really came on the scene in the summer of 1958. They had their first hit single with their cover of Jody Reynolds' Endless Sleep. And of course, Cliff Richard and the Drifters really got it together around the same sort of time with their first single, Move It, and Schoolboy Crush. It was originally released with Schoolboy Crush as the A-side, but Move It proved far more popular, and that was the one that gave them a number 2 as their first UK hit. It was reputedly recorded in just a couple of takes in about 20 minutes, and Cliff liked to play while he was singing in those days, and producer Norrie Paramore apparently allowed Cliff to hold on to his guitar, a bit like a comfort blanket, I guess, a comfort guitar. Well, the lineup by now was Cliff on vocals, Terry Smart drums, and Ian Samwell guitar. Now, one of the bands that really weren't quite so well known at this time, Vince Taylor and the Playboys, they formed in the summer of 58. They didn't really have too much commercial success, but the lineup was really interesting as well as Vince Taylor. It included Tony Sheridan, guitarist, famously went on to record with the Beatles. Brian Bennett became the drummer with the Shadows, and shortly afterwards Brian Locking joined as well, bass player. He went on to fame with the Shadows. He might not have been that well known, Vince Taylor, but he was certainly well enough for David Bowie to use him as one of his major influences for his alter ego Ziggy Stardust. Now, one of the other influences, of course, famously for Ziggy Stardust, was Norman Carl Odom, better known as the legendary Stardust Cowboy. And for our next piece of music from the April of 1959, didn't give him too much commercial success, but this is Vince Taylor and his Playboys, Brand New Cadillac. On the 1st of October 1958, Billy Fury performed on stage at a Marty Wilde concert. That might not surprise you, but it certainly surprised the audience at the time, because that was an impromptu appearance in the second half of Larry Parnes' extravaganza show at Birkenhead's Isolde Theatre. And Marty Wilde was headlining, supported by Vince Eager, John Barry's Seven, famous for the Bond films, early theme tunes. And Ronald Wycherley, who became Billy Fury, now he'd sent a demo tape to Larry Parnes, who was Marty Wilde's manager, and he invited him to meet them both back at the Isolde in the interval. Now what Ronald, Billy Fury, was rather hoping was that he could interest Marty Wilde in recording one of his songs, but he found it was a little bit better than that, and he found himself on stage in the second half of the show. Well, Larry Parnes signed him up on the spot, and he appeared in the extravaganza show the following night. And of course Larry Parnes, as he liked to, changed Ronald Wycherley's name to Billy Fury. And he had his first hit at the beginning of 1959 with Maybe Tomorrow. He actually wrote it. He wrote a lot of his material, which was quite unusual at the time. And another interesting thing that was going on in the late 50s was Chris Barber, the trad jazz band leader we talked about earlier. He was bringing big-time blues artists and gospel singers over to the UK to tour. And in 57, he brought over Sister Rosetta Tharpe, a well-known gospel singer. And late 58, he brought over Muddy Waters for his first UK tour. Now, he was accompanied by his little mate Otis Spann on piano. And on the 26th of October, they made a live recording, that's Muddy Waters, at the Manchester Free Trade Hall, so that's well worth hunting out. And Muddy Waters was very much introducing British audiences to American blues, and what was then a very new sound of the amplified electric guitar. Muddy Waters was a great exponent of that. And in fact, Chris Barber brought Muddy Waters back to the UK again in 1960. And by 1959, by the summer of 59, Cliff Richard and the Drifters were really starting to pick up a head of steam. Their sixth UK hit single, Living Doll, gave them their first UK number one. Interestingly enough, it was the last single as Cliff Richard and the Drifters. And that gave them a hit as well in America, which was quite unusual, because famously Cliff Richard has found very little success over the other side of the pond. And by the end of 1959, Adam Faith was on the scene in the charts. I mean, he'd been around for a while. He'd been in the Worried Men skiffle group back in the Two Eyes days, and that gave him his first UK hit, and that was a number one for 3 weeks. So he started out really rather well. But British rock and roll was very much fading away by the end of the decade, as it was in America. Tommy Steele's latest hit at the end of the 59 was Little White Bull, hardly a rock and roll song, but he really did reinvent himself successfully as a family entertainer. I said by the turn of the decade, beat music was very much to the fore. Now, beat music focused on the whole group rather than just the singer. That was the fundamental difference. Beat met rock and roll on the 10th of May 1960 when the Silver Beatles, which was the last name they used before they called themselves just the Beatles, they failed a Billy Fury audition, and the Silver Beatles at that time were John, Paul and George, with Stu Sutcliffe on bass and Tommy Moore on drums. Now, as just mentioned, Billy Fury was one of Larry Parnes' acts, and the Beatles, Silver Beatles, did get success out of the audition because Larry Parnes signed them up to back Johnny Gentle on his upcoming Scottish tour, and at the end of that tour, Tommy Moore quit the group. And a couple of weeks after the Beatles failed their audition to back Billy Fury, the Cavern had its first beat night, not the two events were associated. Rory Storm, the Hurricanes, played that night. That was with Ringo Starr, he was still with them, and Johnny Guitar. Now, also on the bill that night was Cass and the Casanovas. Now, Cass was Brian Casser. I mentioned earlier, back in the day, it formed a skiffle group with Stones bassist Bill Wyman. The entry fee was just 2 and 6, which is about 12 pence in new money, the price of a couple of beers in those days, 2 and 6. Now, interestingly enough, the Beatles didn't make their debut until the 9th of February 1961, and that was with Pete Best. And it shows that, the Beatles may have gone on to be the biggest group in the world ever, but they weren't necessarily the biggest group in Liverpool in the early 60s. There were an awful lot of good groups in Liverpool at that time. And around the same time, Tony Sheridan and his band The Jets, well, they got on the ferry over to Germany to play in Hamburg, and they were one of the first British bands, if not the first British band, to actually play in Hamburg, and they had a residency at the Kaiser Keller for that particular gig. And at the same time that Tony Sheridan was playing at the Kaiser Keller, Johnny Kidd and the Pirates welcoming in their first #1 hit in the UK. And this is Johnny Kidd and the Pirates with that #1 shaking all over. Larry Parnes, now that's a name that's popped up a number of times during the show. Now, he was an impresario as well as being a manager, and in the summer of 1960 he put on an end of the pier summer show in Great Yarmouth. It was billed as Meet the Beat. Larry Parnes presents the first ever Anglo-American summer show. The American element consisted of singer Davy Jones. Well, that's not to be confused with the British Davy Jones that became one of the famous Monkees. Now, Larry Parnes was one of the first major British rock and roll managers, and he liked to change the names of his acts, and often he tried to reflect the image he wanted to project. His first signing was Tommy Hicks, and he of course became Britain's first rock and roll star as Tommy Steele. Now, his name actually had an origin. It was from his Scandinavian grandfather, Thomas Steele Hicks, spelt S-T-I-L, but pronounced Steele. His next singer was Reginald Smith. Well, he became Marty Wilde. And this particular show in Great Yarmouth in 1960 consisted mostly of acts managed by Larry Parnes. It was headlined by Billy Fury, alongside Vince Eager, Dickie Pride, Johnny Gentle. Backing was provided by Barnes' own house band, the Beat Boys. Now, one act who stayed with his own name, which was quite rare, was Cockney chappie Joe Brown. And in the summer of 61, Joe Meek was still very much to the fore. He'd just produced John Layton's first UK hit, and that was a #1 for Johnny Remember Me. And at the end of 1961, Screaming Lord Sutch and the Savages released their first single, Till the Following Night. That was also a Joe Meek production. Now, Screaming Lord Sutch didn't have an awful lot of success with his singles. He was a very, very flamboyant character. And he's also well known for setting up a political party, the Monster Raving Loony Party. Now, that started out as the Teenage Party and stood against then Prime Minister Harold Wilson in his Huyton constituency in the 1966 general election. And when the votes were returned, it was Harold Wilson, 41,122 votes, David Sutch, Screaming Lord Sutch, 585 votes. But what a character. Also set up his own radio station, pirate radio station. And the end of 1961 also saw Cliff Richard heading off in a new direction. His movie The Young Ones premiered in London, and this very much marked his transition from British rock and roll star to pop star and entertainer. And at the beginning of 1962, Chris Barber was back with a new interval group. And in the 50s, he'd had his skiffle interval group with Lonnie Donegan, but now he was with Alexis Corner and a new interval blues group. Now, Barber set up this interval blues group to back his wife, Ollie Patterson, who was a blues R&B singer, and Alexis Corner was joined, of course, in the interval group by his friend Cyril Davis, harmonica player, 12-string guitar. Shortly afterwards, they formed the Alexis Corners Blues Incorporated. Alexis Corners is a name that's popped up right through this whole story. And interestingly enough, he was born in Paris in 1928. He didn't settle in the UK until around 1939. And by the end of the 40s, he was in Chris Barber's amateur trad jazz band. In 54, he was in Ken Collier's skiffle group. And now in 62, he's back with Chris Barber in the interval blues group. And of course, Blues Incorporated inspired a generation of British blues musicians. Most of the Stones played in the band at some point, Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker. Now, Blues Incorporated is often considered to be the first electric British blues band and is often cited as the first white electric blues band in the world. History was made on the 11th of October 1962 when the Beatles entered the British charts with their first single, Love Me Do, and that was really very much marked the end of the British rock and roll era. Lonnie Donegan had his final hit in the summer of 62 with Pick a Bale of Cotton, interestingly enough, another Lead Belly song, as was his first hit, and Marty Wilde followed suit in the October with his last UK hit, Ever Since You Said Goodbye, and by the summer of 63, beat groups were prominent in the top 20. Interestingly enough, the first successes came from Liverpool and Manchester. I mean, Mersey beat groups, the Beatles, Jenny and the Pacemakers, Searchers, Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas, all had early success. And of course, Freddie and the Dreamers were early into the charts. They were a Manchester group. That's it. I've been Derek Shelmadine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show and the story of 1950s music. That's trad, jazz, skiffle and rock and roll. I hope you've enjoyed the show half as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unravelled. Remember, you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Simply go to my homepage, rockandrollunravelled.com, click on the link to the competition, and good luck with that. Join me next time for another look at some rock and roll unravelled. Now, to play us out, this is the original version of the Searchers' first hit. It wasn't a hit in the UK, but it was a Billboard number 16 in 1961 for one of the great R&B and soul bands. This is The Drifters with the original version of Sweets for My Sweet.